Good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming out tonight. Tonight, I'll demonstrate that God is in control of all world powers, and I'll be focusing on how God has controlled nations in history. I won't be talking about much from the past few decades, as this will be covered in 3 weeks when we have a talk on how God is controlling the current events. There's also an enormous amount of things we can talk about when discussing God's control of world powers. But tonight I'll be primarily focusing on how God controls the nations to achieve what he wants with the people, the Jews. We'll briefly look at tonight why God chose to show a particular interest in the Jews. Then God's prediction of the fall of Israel in AD 70. And then we'll look at the following oppression of the Jews that's after AD 70. And then we'll have a look at what is termed the Fishers and the Hunters, which is Theodore Herzl, Balfour Declaration and the Holocaust. And these were to cause the Jews to return to Israel. And finally, we'll look at the prediction of the formation of Israel. We are Christadelphians, and we believe in an all-powerful God who has a purpose with this earth, and he therefore manipulates peoples and nations to further this purpose. We also believe that the Bible is the infallible word of God, and we base everything we do off the Bible. So if you have a Bible with you, I'll encourage you to follow along with us tonight so you can see for yourself the power of God in the nations. Firstly, the Bible is quite clearly claims that God is in control of the nations, as we read in Daniel 4 verse 17, which at the end of the second half of the verse says, "To the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men." So clearly the Bible here claims that God is both capable of controlling the nations and puts in power whoever he wishes. Firstly, we need to prove that Israel is indeed God's people. This is simply solved by looking at Exodus 6 verse 17, which I'll take from the ESV just to make things a bit simpler, which says, "I will take you to be my people, and I will be your God. And you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who has brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians." So we can clearly see that God has chosen Israel here to be his people. So what does it mean that Israel is God's chosen people? Well, we read that God has chosen Israel to be his people in Isaiah 43, if you could turn there now, please. And beginning at verse 10. "Ye are my witnesses, saith Yahweh, and my servant whom I have chosen, that ye may know and believe me, and understand that I am he. Before me there was no God formed, neither shall there be after me. I, even I, am Yahweh, and beside me there is no Saviour. I have declared and have saved. I have showed there was no strange God among you. Therefore ye are my witnesses, saith Yahweh, that I am God. Yea, before the day was I am he, and there is none that can deliver out of my hand. I will work, and who shall let it?" So when Israel was a nation in ancient times, they were surrounded by nations and peoples who believed in many other gods. And they often had fairly fluid and changing religious beliefs, in contrast to Israel, who only believed in the one God, and that is the God of Israel. And as we know, Israel is still a nation today, but nearly none of these nations around still exist. Therefore, Israel is still a witness of God's existence and power today. And as a result, Israel must continue to survive no matter who or what opposes them or what happens to them. However, this doesn't mean it has been or will be a smooth ride for Israel. Not only have they been through hardships, but they have been through hardships God has deliberately put on them, as we will soon see. So I will spend tonight looking at how God has manipulated world powers to ensure his promises in regard to Israel will be fulfilled. So thus far, we've seen the Bible claims that God is in power and puts in power whoever he wants. God has chosen Israel, or as they are now known, the Jews, to be his people. God is using the Jews as his witnesses, and therefore they cannot be wiped out. And therefore we can see God's control of the nations as he manipulates peoples and nations to get the results he is looking for with his people. So we'll start looking at the predictions regarding his people. The first is the prophecy in Deuteronomy 28, which, if you could turn there now, please. This chapter is often referred to as the chapter of blessings and cursings, as it sets out first a list of blessings that will happen to Israel if they obey and follow God, and then a list of curses that will happen if they don't obey God. Now, Deuteronomy was written about the year 1300 BC, and about 1200 BC, which is roughly 1300 years before the first event we're going to talk about happened. And we have physical copies dated from around 100 BC, which is about 200 years from the event we're about to look at. So any predictions that happen within this chapter are clearly prophetic, as in because they were written before these events happened. In the first century, you find the Druze are discontent with the Romans ruling over them. The Romans have installed rulers who don't carry favour with the populace, and on top of this, various sects of the Jews are gaining traction. Then this boils over in AD 66. Two things happen. A Greek mob profanes a prominent synagogue, which leads to riots among the Jews. And at the same time, Gessius Florus, the Roman ruler of Judah, decides it was a good time to collect overdue taxes. And he achieved this by plundering the treasure of the Jewish temple. And this in turn led to some protests. In retaliation to these protests, Gessius captured and executed thousands of Jews, the majority of whom had nothing to do with any of these issues or protests. The Jews were greatly angered by this, which resulted in Gessius being besieged and later killed by the Jewish horde, and many Romans with him. This was the beginning of the Jewish revolt. The Romans had to deal with this revolt, and they sent General Vespasian to deal with the revolt. So we read of the first prediction in verse 49. And Yahweh shall bring a nation against thee from afar, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flieth, a nation whose tongue thou shalt not understand, a nation of fierce countenance, which shall not regard the person of the old, nor favour to the young. We can see here that the nation here that was predicted to overthrow the Jewish people was a nation from a long way from Israel. And quite key here was they were symbolised by the eagle. This fits the Romans exactly, as they came from a long way from Israel. They spoke a language which the Jews would not speak, as typically Jews only spoke Hebrew, Greek, and a small amount of surrounding languages. However, very few would have spoken Latin, the language of the Romans. On top of this, the Romans used an eagle mounted on a staff to symbolise them in battle. So they very much fitted with this prediction here. So if we continue on in our historical story, we find that Vespasian, the Roman general, moved into Israel and systematically moved around the region, suppressing any resistance from the Jews and wiping out entire villages. The Romans had deliberately made a decision to be exceptionally brutal, to make a point, and brutal they were. Things were so brutal at one point, history tells us, several cities found out of the approach of the Romans, not by messages, but by bodies floating down the Jordan River. And throughout his campaign, Vespasian often let his generals have free rein to do as they wanted with whatever and whoever in the villages and surrounding areas. As a result, the soldiers ate whatever they wanted and took whatever they wanted. So if we read on in verse 51, we read, and he shall, that is Vespasian with his Roman legions, and he shall eat the fruit of thy cattle and the fruit of thy land until thou be destroyed, which also shall not leave thee either corn, wine, oil, or the increase of thy kine, or flocks of thy sheep until he have destroyed thee. So we can see here, this is quite clearly predicted, the destruction of the Jews by the Romans in fairly good detail. And during this time, many of the Jews fled as a result of Vespasian's campaign to avoid the destruction, and this led to many Jews spreading into all the lands all over the empire, as shown here. As you can see, the Jews emigrated from to many places, including all the way to the British Isles, all the way back to Turkey. Now we continue our story on reading in verse 52. And he shall besiege thee in all thy gates, until thy high and fenced walls come down, wherein thou trustest. Throughout all thy land he shall besiege thee in all thy gates throughout all thy land, which Yahweh thy God hath given thee. And thou shalt eat the fruit of thine own body, the flesh of thy sons and of thy daughters, which Yahweh thy God hath given thee, in the siege and in the straitness, wherein thy enemies shall distress thee. So that the man that is tender among you, and very delicate, his eye shall be evil toward his brother, and toward the wife of his bosom, and toward the remnant of his children, which he shall leave. So that he will not give to any of them of the flesh of his children whom he shall eat, because he hath have nothing left him in the siege, and in the straitness, wherewith thine enemies shall distress thee in thy gates. Thy tender and delicate woman among you, which would not venture to set the sole of her foot upon the ground for delicateness and tenderness, her eye shall be evil toward the husband of her bosom, and toward her son, and toward her daughter, and toward her young one that cometh out from between her feet, and toward her children which she shall bear. She shall eat them for want of all things secretly in the siege and straitness, wherewith thine enemy shall distress thee in thy gates. And this is actually pretty much exactly what we find happening in Jerusalem when they were besieged by Vespasian. Soon after the siege, after sieging the city, the Romans built a wall around Jerusalem, blocking off any escape. Any of the Jewish military who tried to escape were crucified and put on display to those in the city. And any of those who were not associated with the revolt, who tried to escape, had their stomachs sliced open, as many of the Jews were trying to escape with their gold and money, and they did this by swallowing it. Once the Romans found out about this, they took to the habit of opening them up. Josephus, a writer at the time, writes in his book, The Wars of the Jews, about the brutality of the Romans at the time. And he writes, "Throughout the city, people were dying of hunger in large numbers, enduring unspeakable sufferings. In every house, the merest hint of food sparked violence, and close relatives fell to blows, snatching from one another the pitiful supports of life. No respect was paid even to the dying. The ruffians, that is, the anti-Roman zealots, searched them in case they were concealing food somewhere in their clothes, or just pretending to be near death. Gaping with hunger like mad dogs, Lawless gangs went staggering, reeling through the streets, battered upon the doors like drunkards, and so bewildered that they broke into the same house 2 or 3 times in an hour. Need drove the starving to gnaw at anything. Refuse, which even animals would reject, was collected and turned into food. In the end, they were eating belts and shoes and leather strips stripped off their shields. Tufts of withered grass was devoured and sold in little bundles for 4 drachmas. But why dwell on the commonplace rubbish which the starving were driven to feed upon? Give it that which I have recount is an act unparalleled in history, either the Greeks or the barbarians, as horrible to relate as it is incredible to hear. For my part, I should gladly have omitted this tragedy, lest I should be suspected of monstrous fabrication. But there were many witnesses of it among my contemporaries, and besides, I should do a poor service to my country if I were to suppress the agonies she went through. This is talking about a story about a woman who's about to eat her own child. And he continues on, among the residents of the region beyond Jordan was a woman called Mary, daughter of Eliezer, of the village of Bethzaba. She was well off and of good family, and had fled to Jerusalem with her relatives, where she became involved in the siege. Most of the property she had packed up and brought with her from Perea had been plundered by the tyrants, and the rest of her treasure, together with such foods as she had been able to procure, was being carried away by the henchmen. That is, the henchmen of the Zealots. In their daily raids, her bitter resentment of the poor woman cursed and abused these extortioners, and this incensed them against her. However, no one put her to death, either from exasperation or pity. She grew weary of trying to find food for her kinsfolk. In any case, it was by now impossible to get any, wherever you tried. Famine gnawed at her victuals, and the fire of rage was ever fiercer than famine. So, driven by fury and want, she committed a crime against nature. Seizing her child, an infant at the breast, she cried, "My poor baby, why should I keep you alive in this world of war and famine? Even if we live till the Romans come, they will make slaves of us anyway, and hunger will get us before slavery does. And the rebels are crueler than them both. Come, be food for me, and avenge fury to the rebels." And a tale of cold horror to the world to complete the monstrous agony of the Jews. With these words, she killed her son, roasted the body, and swallowed half of it, and stored the rest in a safe place. But the rebels were at her once, smelling roasted meat, threatening to kill her instantly if she had not produced it. She assured them that she had saved them a share, and revealed the remains of her child. Seized with horror and stupefaction, they stood paralysed at the sight. But she said, "This is my own child and my own handiwork. Eat, for I have eaten already. Do not show yourselves weaker than a woman, or more pitiful than a mother. But if ye have pious scruples, shrink away from human sacrifice. Then what I have eaten can count as your share, and I will eat what is left as well." At that they slunk away, trembling, not daring to eat, although they were reluctant to yield even this food to the mother, sorry. So we can see here what was predicted in Deuteronomy 28, where it talks about people even eating their own children. It's actually exactly what happened. And then once the Jews were defeated by the Romans, and the Romans took the city, they massacred most of the Jews. The estimates from history range from about 600,000 to 1.1 million Jews being killed, and the remaining 97,000 were enslaved and sold to people all over the empire. Following the defeat of the Jews in the Jewish revolt, the Jews made a few more minor revolts after the fall of Jerusalem, which was suppressed by the Romans in a similar manner. But long after this, the Jews ceased to act as an independent state and ended up living all over the then known world, as they no longer had a land to go to. So to summarise this section, the Roman invasion, suppression and utter destruction of the Jews soon after Christ's crucifixion was predicted, including all of the gory details of death and cannibalism. So now we move on to the following persecution of the Jews over the next few centuries. For the next few decades, the Jews had some peace. However, this changed when the Roman Empire turned Christian. From about the year 300, the Jews had progressively more and more laws made against them. Firstly, they were forbidden to marry Christians. Then they were forbidden from holding positions in government. Then they were forbidden against witnessing in court. As the ostracization of Jews was formalized, bizarre stories and rumors started to be told about them. Stories about Jews with horns and tails who committed ritualistic murder were spread around. Then in 1095, when the Crusades started, men travelling to Israel, the Crusaders travelling to Israel, acted more like a mob than a disciplined army. A mob which did not have proper logistics to feed troops, nor discipline to control troops. As a result, the troops turned to taking things by force. They could only take food from communities that they would not be punished for taking things from. Therefore, they targeted the Jewish groups in the area. The troops swept through these Jewish communities, looting, raping, and killing as they wished. Later, these turned into more formal organised massacres, which resulted in a new word being coined, which is a pogrom, which was the organised massacre of a targeted group of people. As a result, many Jewish people were killed and others had to flee their homes, leaving them to be looted and sacked. Then, during the middle of the 14th century, a few centuries on, the bubonic plague spread throughout Europe, killing an estimated 1/3 of the population. Fear, superstition, and ignorance prompted the need to find someone to blame. The Jews were a convenient scapegoat because of the myths and stereotypes that they already had believed about them. This led to many persecutions of the Jews, including being burned alive, of about 100,000 of them. Increasingly, Jews were subject to political and economic and social discrimination, resulting in the removal of their legal and civil rights. They were restricted to living in ghettos by the beginning of the 13th century, and Jews were required to wear a distinctive symbol, or pointed hat. Since Jews were not allowed to own land and the church did not allow Christians to loan money for profit, Jews had few alternatives but to become moneylenders. Once they became associated with this forbidden trade of usury, the practice of lending money and charging high interest rates, a set of new stereotypes evolved around the Jews as money hungry and greedy. This in turn furthered their discrimination. So we can see that Jews were quite obviously ostracized, discriminated against, and often killed for the heritage and circumstances they found themselves in. And this is actually what we find again in Deuteronomy 28, if you're reading from verse 64. And Yahweh shall scatter thee among all people, from one end of the earth even unto the other, and there thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. And among these nations thou shalt find no ease, neither shall the sole of thy foot have rest. But Yahweh shall give thee a trembling heart and failing eyes, and sorrow of mind. And thy life shall hang in doubt before thee, and thou shalt fear day and night, and shalt have no assurance of thy life. In the morning thou shalt say, would God it were even. And at even thou shalt say, would God it were morning, for the fear of thine heart wherewith thou shalt fear, and for the sight of thine eyes which thou shalt see. So we can clearly see from this, after the fall of the Jewish state, the Jews would be scattered throughout the land and then persecuted continuously. So to summarise this section, the Jews were gradually ostracised from society following the crucifixion of Christ. This led to many persecutions and deaths for no reason other than the Jewish heritage they carried. Later, the Jews being forced to lend money to make a living resulted in them being known as greedy and money-loving, furthering their discrimination. And of course, this is all predicted in Deuteronomy 28, where it clearly predicts the fear they would have for their lives and the hatred they would receive. Next, we'll have a look at what is termed the hunters and fishers. If you could come to Jeremiah 16. Jeremiah 16 and reading from verse 15. But Yahweh liveth, that brought up the children of Israel from the land of the north, and from all the lands whither he had driven them. And I will bring them again into their land that I gave unto their fathers. Behold, I will send many fishers, saith Yahweh, and they shall fish them. And after will I send many hunters, and they shall hunt them from every mountain and from every hill, out of the holes of the rocks. Here we can see that God wants the Jews to return to their land. As it says, I will bring them back into their land that I gave unto their fathers. And to do this, he uses what he terms hunters and fishers. So what are these hunters and fishers? As the verse indicates, they are people or groups of people who are to make the Jews return to Israel. The fishers will lure the Jews back by various means, and the hunters are those who will force them or intimidate them back into going back to the land of Israel. The first of these we'll be looking at tonight is Theodor Herzl. He was born in about 1860 and was a Jew that had grown up a non-religious Jew. However, it wasn't long before he noticed that just how much people seemed to hate the Jews. He first campaigned for Jews to convert to Christianity to put an end to this hatred, but this didn't work, as he discovered the hatred of the Jews was not so much about their religion, but more that they were hated just as a people. Then what is called the Dreyfus Affair happened. The Dreyfus Affair was about a Jew who fully assimilated into French society and was a officer in the French army. However, Dreyfus was framed for spying despite the strong evidence to the contrary. Dreyfus was then court-martialed and convicted and sent to Devil's Island to be imprisoned. However, during the trial, Theodor Herzl was present and witnessed the crowd continuously chanting death to the Jew. This made Herzl think the Jews would never be safe if they didn't have their own country, as if Dreyfus, a high-ranking official in the French army, could be framed for spying and convicted when the evidence made it clear that he wasn't involved in the spying, then he concluded that the only solution was for the Jews to have their own separate country. Herzl then went on a mission to bring about this dream. He went around Europe and the Middle East trying to convince Jews to come back to Israel. He spent large portions of his life following this cause, to the point where people thought he was mad. He even received audiences with many rulers, including the German Kaiser, the Ottoman Sultan, and even the Pope. Herzl argued that the Jews were a nation without a homeland, and if they had a homeland, they would be able to rule themselves and be free of the anti-Semitism in the countries they currently lived in. Herzl continued to try to convince Jews to move back to Israel, but very few listened. The next thing we'll look at is the Balfour Declaration. The next major time of fishing God sent was the Balfour Declaration. Prior to World War I, the Ottoman Turks had control of what is now called Israel. Then during World War I, the British and the Allies pushed the Ottomans out of Israel. After the war, the British maintained control over Israel under what is called the British Mandate. Soon after the Ottomans were pushed out of Israel by the British, Lord Balfour, the Foreign Secretary for the United Kingdom, wrote a letter to the leader of the Zionist Federation of Great Britain and Ireland. This letter is now known as the Balfour Declaration and is stated as follows. His Majesty's government view with favour the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavours to facilitate the achievement of this object. It being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. This meant that Jews were given permission and supported in moving back to Israel, but still very few Jews made the move. Since only a few Jews were coming back to Israel, or comparatively only a few Jews were coming back to Israel, God turned to another tool he had predicted to use, and that was the hunters. And the most famous of these, of course, was the systematic hunting down, persecution and execution of Jews along with other minorities under Nazi rule. This, of course, is now known as the Holocaust. I'm sure many of you know of the horror of the Holocaust, but I'll provide a brief summary for those who are unaware. Here the Jews were first removed from the rest of society and forced to live in ghettos. Here they lived in very cramped conditions. One apartment might have multiple families living in it, and often the plumbing broke down, meaning human waste was thrown into the street with the garbage. Disease spread rapidly, and the Germans also limited the food purchases, meaning that there was often not enough food to go around. During winter months, heating fuels were scarce, meaning many homes would not be heated, and many of the occupants lacked adequate clothing to keep themselves warm. Some even took their lives to escape from the horrific conditions. Many children were orphaned and had to live on the streets as a result, and these often froze to death in the winters. Later, the Germans turned to what they called the final solution. They changed from imprisoning the Jews in ghettos to either killing or enslaving them. Jews were rounded up and transported to camps to be used as labour. Those the Germans saw unfit to work, such as the sick, the elderly, and children, were either shot before transporting or gassed on arrival to the camps. At the camps, Jews were worked until they died from the various diseases, injuries, or insufficient food provided to them. This period of torture, humiliation, and death made it clear to the Jews that they needed a homeland for life to be safe. Therefore, Jews began to migrate to Israel in huge numbers. However, they were not a nation yet, as they were still Jews living under British rule in Palestine. So to summarise this section, God needed the Jews to move back into the land of Israel. So he organised for what Jeremiah called the fishers and hunters. These fishers and hunters included Theodor Herzl, who first raised the issue and pushed for a land just for the Jews, while encouraging the Jews to move back to Israel. However, not many did. Then God sent Lord Balfour to make the Balfour Declaration, which gave the support of Britain to the Jews to establish in Israel. But still, comparatively few moved. As a result, God had no other option but to send the hunters. The primary one being the Holocaust, which God used to show the Jews there was no safe land outside of Israel. And as a result, many of the Jews did indeed move to Israel. Next, we must look at the formal formation of the Jewish state. If you could come over to Ezekiel 37. Now, Ezekiel wrote roughly in between 570 and 592 BC. So anything we read here is quite clearly prophetic when of speaking of the Jews reforming their land, their nation. So starting reading in verse 1. The hand of Yahweh was upon me and carried me out in the spirit of Yahweh and set me down in the midst of the valley, which was full of bones. And then reading on in verse 4 and 5. Again he said unto me, prophesy unto these bones, and say unto them, O ye dry bones, hear the word of Yahweh. Thus saith the Lord God unto these bones, behold, I will cause breath to enter into you, and ye shall live. And then in verse 10. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and breath came into them, and they lived, and stood up upon their feet, an exceeding great army. So as you can see from this very brief look at Ezekiel 37, way back nearly 2,600 years ago, God foretold of the return of Israel to their land and the reformation of their nation, or army as Ezekiel calls it here, which happened in 1948. So to summarise what we've seen tonight, we can see there is plenty of evidence that God is in control of the nations. We have seen that God predicted the fall of Israel and Jerusalem in AD 70, how that it had to be a nation from a far country who spoke a language the Jews did not know and was symbolised by an eagle. And this, of course, perfectly fits with the Romans. And we saw how the Romans besieged Jerusalem and that people got so desperate that they ate their own children, which was predicted in Deuteronomy 28 as well. Then we saw how the Jews were oppressed in the lands they fled to and were ostracised and therefore could not find any ease in life, as once again was predicted in Deuteronomy 28. Then we saw how God used what he terms the hunters and the fishers to get the Jews to return to the land. And this was through Theodor Herzl and the Balfour Declaration, encouraging them to move to Israel and helping them to do so. But this did not work on any large scale. So God was forced to send what he terms the hunters, which culminated in the Holocaust, which was so horrific and brutal, God knew the Jews would have seen no option but to move back to Israel. So we can quite clearly see God's hand in work in the nations and how he can move nations and people around to get the results he wants. And of course, a God who is this powerful is a God who can do many things, many other things, including giving you and I life after death. However, unfortunately, this is a topic for another time, so we'll have to leave it there. So thank you for listening.